Hi, welcome to this lecture about the burden of non-communicable diseases, what causes it, and what we can do to prevent it. My name is Dr. Taavi Tillmann. I've got a BSc in psychology alongside my medical degree. Then I did an MSc in public health and a PhD in the epidemiology of heart disease across different parts of the world. And I'm specializing in the practical side of public health medicine. So I'm in the end of the the registrar scheme, which in some countries is known as a residency. So I've got a part-time role in UCL and a part-time role in one of the city boroughs of London called Southwark, where we look after one of the screening programs called the Health Checks program for heart disease. Okay, so today, this is the sort of framework I'd like to take you through. In chronology, what usually happens is we'd like to find out where disease is, who's got it, what sorts of disease they have. Then we move on to other questions such as what's causing that disease, secondly, and thirdly, what we could intervene with to remove that cause. Sometimes when we can't remove the root cause, we have to go downstream and look at screening opportunities. And if that fails, then as a fifth step, once symptoms have started, the usual healthcare system comes in by diagnosis and treatment. So let's start off with the first step of what epidemiologists know about the cause, about the burden and spread of non-communicable disease. This is data from the Global Burden of Disease study that I signposted in my pre-lecture notes. You should definitely have a look at and play with their online visualization. But just to point out how the the rates of non-communicable disease, and here is a metric called a DALI that synthesizes both how many deaths there are, it's worse, i.e. redder, if people die very early, and it's also capturing how ill people are before they die. So if you have, let's say, long-standing back pain for many decades, that also makes a country look redder. And as a synthesis of all that burden of non-communicable disease, which is predominantly heart disease and cancer and diabetes, we see a very striking gradient whereby the most NCDs tend to be concentrated in the eastern part of Europe and Russia, with comparatively little in Western Europe. Possibly because things are more advanced in Western Europe, but also less so in Sub-Saharan Africa, probably because those countries have not yet come out of other health challenges to come into the NCD challenge that middle-income countries typically face. So we can see that just numerically, if you look at the data, there's about twice as much NCD burden in countries like Ukraine compared to France. But more interesting is when you look within a country such as the United States and you break it down into its underlying states, you find that countries that are very red, such as West Virginia, also have twice as much NCD burden compared to very good countries like California. And the same pattern is seen in other countries such as the UK, where there's twice as much NCD burden in Scotland and parts of Northern England when compared to the average across London. So wide diversity, both in large areas and small. And as a kind of summary of that, you could look at all types of death and disease being one of three types as they categorize in this study. Group one is a composite, sorry if my face is blocking the shot, but group one is a composite of communicable diseases and maternal health issues, which tends to predominantly affect low-income countries in the light green. Then injuries are quite a small fraction, and the NCD burden tends to increase as you go up the income classification, which might be slightly misleading because if you break it down a bit more granularly, you find that there are countries in the middle, just between the upper middle income and high income country, and right between that border where the burden is greatest, such as Ukraine and Russian Federation, that I've done a little bit of research on looking at why that is so, which we'll talk about later. But that tends to be the typical kind of epidemiological transition as countries move from low income to high income that you need to be aware of. Okay, so let's look at some of the causes, which we can think about as risk factors, which may or may not be causal, and some risk factors turn out to be causal while other risk factors are non-causal. But we're particularly interested in the causal risk factors because those are the ones that you should be removing in step 3. The same study that I've been citing throughout, which I really encourage you to play with, visualizes this as follows for high-income countries. So the NCD burden, it's in total is in blue, and where we know the cause to some degree, that's dark blue, whereas for the cause is unknown, that's light blue. So just run about half and half, meaning that if we were to eradicate all these causes, we could prevent almost half of NCDs overnight, whereas the remaining half we cannot prevent, and we'll have to leave for screening systems and the healthcare system to pick up. When we look at which particular causes cause NCDs across the world, this is the slightly updated ranking, which was released a couple of weeks ago on the Lancet's page, but previous years' rankings looks broadly similar. We find that the 4 red boxes that I've circled, highlighted, are the most important upstream, more kind of fundamental behavioral risk factors, namely tobacco, diet, air pollution, and alcohol. And I highlight those as being more kind of prominent or important because often they cause some of the more intermediary risk factors. So if you are a smoker, you'll find that this elevates your blood pressure. If you have a poor diet, this also elevates your blood pressure whilst giving you elevated glucose, LDL, et cetera, et cetera. So they're interrelated, and the boxed ones are slightly further upstream, with the biomedical approaches in the middle before people have disease. And the kind of theory here is that it's valid to intervene with either way. If you have a public health system that's strong and you're able to focus on tobacco, diet, air pollution, and alcohol, that's much cheaper, more effective, and probably is the best way to go. And with that, you can create a lot of progress. However, some countries, for political reasons, might find that challenging, and they may choose to instead try to find people that have high blood pressure, glucose, LDL, pick them up one by one and give them some medicalized services to treat those intermediate risk factors. And that's another valid way to prevent diseases, but often is more expensive. However, politically, it seems to appeal to a range of parties, regardless of their ideology. And I'll just make the point here that it's interesting how low physical activity, whilst is important, is not as important as, say, diet in the grand scheme of things. I think the numbers are approximately in the order of 1 to 10. So, basically saying getting people to diet, to eat better food is 10 times more important than getting people to exercise more. And that's something that which really isn't prominent in the media debates. If you look at lay presentations of, for example, why people put on weight, it's often seen as being 50% diet, 50% activity levels. And that is probably an intentional outcome of the dietary industry being, of the food industry, the unhealthy food industry, being very heavily involved with framing that narrative and setting the debate about what causes what, and being quite often inappropriately invited to high-level debates about, why are people putting on weight and what should we do about it, where they're trying to escape from their due blame and to instead blame people's activity levels, perhaps inappropriately, because the true burden there is quite small. Okay, so the big 4 I'd like you to kind of remember in your mind's eye are tobacco, diet, and air pollution, and alcohol. And we'll look at some of these in detail now. But before we go on to that, I'll just make a quick sort of sketch about what happens in this space of light blue areas where we've got no idea, what's causing the vast majority of neurological disease, musculoskeletal. We're still in our infancy here. And I was looking at this small, but still small proportion, but still a large area of unexplainable cardiovascular disease. And in my earlier research, I asked the question whether education is a causal risk factor, i.e., if the government were to somehow encourage people to stay in school for longer and get more qualifications, perhaps by realigning financial incentives or other powers they may have to encourage people to stay in school for longer, would that 50 years later prevent those people from having heart attacks? And we've known there's been an association between those parameters before, but we weren't really sure whether it was due to cause and effect. And you may have watched the video that I signposted as well, which goes into this a bit more detail. But to summarize, we've known from previous studies, and I compared this as well, that the estimates from observational studies where we're not sure about causality gives you estimates, and I'm sorry, my face is hiding these numbers, but I can move my face with my mouse and you can't see that. So that's how it's working in this recording. The prevalence estimate is that if you stay in school for 3 years longer and get a bachelor's degree, that will prevent about 27% of heart attacks based on looking at snapshots, cross-sectional studies of prevalence. If you follow people up longitudinally, that works out to be around about 20%, just a slight tweak on the same metric. But both of these are observational studies, so we're not sure if it's cause and effect. Now, the analysis I did was using genes as sort of mini trials, where we basically don't argue that genes cause a big impact on education, and we don't argue that genes cause a big impact on education either, but we use genes as little simulations because we know that when people inherit genes, that's quite random, the way that chromosomes get pulled apart and one gets picked and not the other when a fetus is conceived. So that random nature of creating a fetus is what we exploited here in this study to find that people that did get that genetic material that pushed them towards having slightly more education in school also later in life had slightly less heart disease. And when we looked at various analyses, we saw they aligned quite nicely with similar ballpark estimates that round about a degree bachelor's of education is worth 20-30% less heart attacks 50 years later, which is quite a big effect and quite important one to know about if we want to argue for changes to educational policy. And then we looked in more detail about what some of the risk factors might be that could explain it, and it might be that smoking is one of the pathways, i.e. you push people to stay in school for longer, they smoke less, they have less heart attacks. That explains a little bit of it, but not all of it. Some of it's still mysterious. But I won't dwell on my personal pet topics for too long now, and we'll move on to looking at something going again back to the international kind of questions of what's causing international differences and also within country differences. So when we take all that epidemiology, everything we know, all the things that I've just shown you about, we know these risk factors and we know which countries have more or high levels of these risk factors and how bad they are. We know which countries have more or less disease, and we plug it into a big model and say, hey, this is how much disease we think these countries should be having. This is the prediction of, based on everything we know, how much NCDs there should be in these countries. And our science and our models tell us that Northern America and Europe should be swamped with NCDs. The models predict that Russia should have less NCD, which is counterintuitive because when we look at the actual data, what we observe with how many heart attacks there are, we see the opposite trend. And that divergence between what we predict and what we see is basically to illustrate that there's lots of things that science still has not yet answered. And that's fascinating. If you're interested in research, get stuck in some of these debates. I had my go at some of that, and I looked at a particular cohort study to try to look at this gradient from Western Europe to Central Europe to Eastern Europe that we know we can observe, which is for sure. And I looked to see whether bringing in more explanatory power from new risk factors could account for that international gradient. So in brief, we did 4 kind of cohort studies in 4 different countries, Czech Republic, Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. And we used the same approach in each country, collected data and run about sort of 8,000, 10,000 people in each country who were all healthy, middle-aged, and then waited 10 years to see which of them got heart attacks. And hundreds of people did. And then I created models to try to predict or explain why it is that people get heart attacks, and also to explain why it is that Russia has, at least 2, if not 4 times as many people getting heart attacks than countries in Central Europe. So the kind of summary that I found, which was kind of interesting for me at least, was that if you compare a man living in Russia versus a man living in a Central European country like Poland or the Czech Republic, and I'm sorry again that my face is blocking the point estimate. Just underneath my left shoulder here, there's a little dot or a square that says that men in Russia have 2.5 times more heart disease events than men in Central Europe, and that's a big issue. That's massive. Now, and for women, it's a little bit less. It's about 1.5, 50 times more, 50% more, 1.5 is the hazard ratio. But still, a big one that we should try to explain. And if we can explain it, then we should try to move that dot close to the one line. And then once it hits the one, then we know we've accounted for it. Now, in the classical models that I was trying to make better, when we account for all the conventional things that I've just shown you around, blood pressure and smoking and LDL cholesterol and whatnot, when we account for that and hypothesize that maybe men in Russia have more blood pressure problems or higher LDL levels, when we throw that in, the black square doesn't move at all. It stays in the 2.5 space for men and in the 1.5 space for women, meaning that these risk factors don't explain any of that international gap at all. And then the novel bit came in when I threw in lots of psychosocial risk factors like, are you feeling a bit depressed? Are you living alone? Are you out of work? Are you on low income? You have, poverty issues, all sorts of things. You not see your friends or family very often. And when you throw all that in, again, it doesn't really bulge, which was a bit of a shame. It's moved slightly for women, but not that much. So the bottom line that we learned from this analysis, which if you're interested, you can look at in this paper in PLOS Medicine, is that even when we account for everything that we know about what might plausibly cause heart disease, it doesn't explain why Russia has twice as much heart disease than Central Europe. And new hypotheses are very much in need. So if you've got one, try and have a crack at the whip. Okay, so and just to make the point that even if you do a study and you find the answer is no, i.e. it's a null finding, it's still important to work at it rigorously and to get it published. Otherwise, we will never know, and that's why we can now move on from this space and look at other hypotheses. So null findings are an important stage of closure for science, that we can park something as bygone and move on to new territories. Okay, so we talked a little bit about basic science and epidemiology and what's causing what, but let's think about what we can do in the real world, what we can do to take action, to do something to make a difference on the ground. Smoking rates, they went up dramatically in the first half of the 20th century from almost zero smoking. This was recorded as how many cigarettes are smoked per year, per capita, to very high levels in the 1960s, around about 4,000 cigarettes per capita per year. And then in kind of after a slight lag of perhaps a decade or two or three, then we see the same pattern of going up for the rates of lung cancer, which is the red line, while other cancers were either flatlining or even coming down. So that increase in lung cancer was entirely due to the increase in smoking, nothing else. However, despite the pessimism, we've got historical lessons to learn from that paint a very positive story. So here's one to look at price as a potential lever or something to do. Now, if we begin with the dot, not the square, so the dot is the bottom line, and the axis for that would be on the left-hand side. Basically, in Canada, the price of tobacco had pretty much flatlined since the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and in the early 80s, the government decided to finally increase the price of tobacco to make it less affordable, purposefully for health reasons, whilst also bringing in some extra revenue to the government, which the government liked. And after it did that, and I'm sorry that my face again is blocking it, the price went up roughly twofold over about a decade. And you see pretty much instantly the consumption of tobacco and how many cigarettes were smoked per capita come down from around about 4,000 to 1,500, in the same time period. So phenomenal improvements in cutting this unhealthy behavior in half, just over a decade, with quite a powerful policy lever. Don't know if you can see because my face may be blocking this, but what happened next was there was a change of government. They decided to go back on that policy for one reason or another, which certainly annoyed some health advocates. But they then lowered the price of tobacco, and they saw a corresponding increase in smoking, which was bad news for health. However, the increase was not as vast as it was in the initial phase. So maybe despite the ups and downs over time, there's a positive net trend, even by the sheer act of debating about these things in the media so publicly. People will start to think and question their smoking behavior just from an information perspective alone, on top of the economic purchasability effect. But tobacco has illustrated how price is probably the most number one powerful signal and lever that you have, with which you can very quickly really radically change behavior to try to encourage people to make the healthier choice. Another dimension might be advertisement. So just some snippets from the last century, really, how back in the First World War in Canada, if you were, let's say, the wife of a soldier fighting in Europe, concerned about your husband, and you saw a poster and you thought, oh, he really wants to smoke, you could donate 25 cents and they will top up your money with a whole dollar's worth of extra contribution, so you can leverage your charitable donation and send a whole dollar's worth of tobacco to soldiers who are fighting. So this now sounds really, really crazy, really silly, because not only would it make these soldiers fight less vigorously during the actual battle moments if their lungs are clogged up with tar, but decades later, many would come back and die of lung cancer. So an awful thing to do. And in hindsight, we can now look back and almost laugh. But I'm sure that if you were there, caught in those years and having thoughts about the policy debates today and thinking, maybe we shouldn't be doing these advertisements, and maybe we should try to, not put them in people's faces so much. Maybe we shouldn't get people like Ronald Reagan talking about how he's sending Chesterfield to all his friends for Christmas because it's the merriest Christmas anybody can have. Or the concept of co-branding doctors with camels, because apparently there's some benefits in the throat, the T sign, all signs of bizarre things that we now really find completely unethical and immoral. But over time, step by step, people have made an argued case and politicians have passed it through. And now we look back and these things look really ridiculous. So with the case of advertisement restrictions, it's a slow march, but it's usually in one direction. It's very hard to go back from these cigarette packets that we have today to having a nice red pack with no warnings anymore. That's just unthinkable. So far, I've mentioned the advertisement and tax dimension. The third big hammer really is making things less accessible by disallowing who's allowed to buy a product at a given time or an age or location. So I remember when I was 16, I was allowed to buy tobacco, and then now it's seen as bizarre for shops to sell tobacco to kids who are age 16 and 17. So nudging up the purchasing age is one example, and a very radical idea that's been kind of floated is the idea that the age at which you're allowed to buy tobacco should increase by 1 year every calendar year, and that means that the old cohort are allowed to carry on smoking, but the new cohort should never be given the legal right to buy tobacco, because no parents of a 17-year-old really want their child to walk out into a world that then empowers them to go out and buy tobacco, because we know how harmful it is. That's not yet been put into law, but it's a powerful vehicle with which to eradicate tobacco in a generation. Okay, so those are the kind of what we call large population-based sledgehammers that we know work very well, but are politically challenging. It depends on who's in power. And then we've got more individualized approaches, things like drugs and counseling, which are politically very attractive to all parties, but can be more expensive. And for example, with the decline of smoking, we see that the very first phase in decline was driven by these large sledgehammers around price and advertisement restrictions. And only later on, people were starting to introduce smoking cessation counseling services, one-on-one chats with nurses and thinking about nicotine replacement patches and the like. But it would be unthinkable to go back to the 60s and to offer one-on-one smoking cessation services to anybody who wished to access them, because if half your population are smoking, you're not going to be able to get 100 million Americans through the door to chat to a nurse about nicotine replacement therapy. Even if that had been invented, you wouldn't have the nurses to deal with that army of demand. So it makes sense to start with population sledgehammers when things are very common, and if they become rarer, then more individualized targeted approaches can be an attractive route to pick up the slack at the end. And again, hiding behind my face is the red line of tobacco causing lung cancer rates that are also coming down beautifully since then. So tobacco does paint a beautiful picture of great progress and decline. And whilst it remains a huge burden in the world, especially in middle income countries where advertisement restrictions haven't really kicked in. For example, if you ever get to travel to Indonesia, you'd be shocked to see very similar adverts that I've just shown you from Europe from last century, still floating about on massive billboards. So globally, it still remains a big issue. But we can learn from that and think about what we might do differently for diet or alcohol, where we've been more relaxed and less heavy-handed to date. I was born in Estonia, a small country in Northeast Europe, and I've been interested in following the debates around alcohol policy in Estonia and Eastern Europe because it is a big issue. People have historically drank a lot of vodka. It's caused great health harm. And here's a plot. If you start off with the blue line, the GDP per capita since the fall of communism really has shot through the roof. You know, one of these remarkable success stories, people's incomes really going up. And then in parallel to that, the pink line shows how the amount of alcohol you can afford with an average salary has also shot up roughly twofold in the time of only 10 years. So if within a 10-year period, you're giving people twice as much alcohol affordability, that's going to encourage some people to drink more alcohol. And that's exactly what you see with the green line. Alcohol consumption per capita also pretty much doubling within just less than 10 years. So quite worrying trends there. And similar things have happened in other countries, but rarely as quickly. And this is a hyper sort of fast kind of condensation of what's happened in the UK in the past 40 years, for example. But it makes the case that we have to think about alcohol affordability as a policy issue if we want to get people's consumption to come down. And hiding behind my face, I'll show on this slide, maybe it's a bit better, is that there's been tremendous progress since the, we'll start with the 2007 financial recession. The blue line then takes a dip down, which you can see here too, for a couple of years, and then starts to recover. So GDP has been going upwards. And I've plotted down here in the same years how many litres of alcohol an average Estonian bought. And it came down with the recession. So recession was actually good for people to buy less alcohol. And after the GDP has recovered, we've managed to keep that alcohol level sort of flatlining and even slightly coming down due to a combination of very similar policies that we just mentioned for tobacco. Price increases. You wouldn't believe it, but alcohol adverts are now banned, full stop. And when I'm in London and I see the tube and it has all these big adverts for Tennessee whiskey and all sorts of things, it does make me think a little bit back to these images of tobacco adverts from last century, how perhaps one day we will see alcohol adverts as being slightly controversial. And some countries like Estonia are leading the way with that, and we've seen some great benefits already with that. Okay, so that's just the idea of alcohol. And the final one that's also a kind of one of my pet favorites is food. So what we should be eating, if you look at the science, is lots of fruits, veg, legumes, oils, and vegetable oils and nuts. Around about 2/3 or even 3/4 of your diet should be plants, this green stuff. And what we really eat is very few plants and lots of extra unnecessary things that are often the white box in my top diagram includes sweets, heavy carbohydrates like potato, rice, pasta, all sorts of processed foods, snacks. All that extra stuff could potentially be cut dramatically in half in order to make space for the green stuff that we need. And if we think about air travel as another important kind of policy area with which to intervene, if you have all these cars driving around, for example, Los Angeles or many other common cities in the world, each of them's polluting a lot. Whereas if you can get them all on a bus, maybe that one bus does have occasionally bad exhaust fumes. It's only one bus rather than sort of 40. If you get them all on bikes, there's no pollution whatsoever. Plus, they're all doing exercise to get a great sense of well-being. And the idea this picture is trying to illustrate is the land space you can save, so you can cut back on all these lanes and start using that space for whatever else you want to use. You can put nice green spaces down for people to enjoy a picnic on. You could potentially build things, all sorts of things you could do. But cars require a lot of space, so that's one reason to not prefer car-based transport. And Finland, also in Northeast Europe, has done remarkably well with its reduction in heart disease rates, having come down round about sort of 80% in a generation. So back in the 70s, the heart disease rates were 100%. Now it's down to 20. You know, they've cut it 80%. Phenomenal success rates. We can explain most of that. And that's the red line from the combination of smoking, blood pressure, and cholesterol. Just to drive the point home that this is not all just abstract theory, but countries have done it, and we should follow their example. Just to say that what I've said is not only my personal opinion, but many of the key kind of strategy documents from the WHO, such as these files that I'd encourage you to Google, or publications in the Lancet, will basically echo what we've been talking about. And my own personal sort of take-home table of what most countries should usually be doing, especially in middle and upper income countries, is any of these options, but especially the top rows, because they tend to be the most important ones. So with price, you should make tobacco more expensive, alcohol more expensive, unhealthy foods more expensive, healthy foods less expensive, which will also help with BMI, because diet is the main driver of BMI. You should try to encourage or even ban smoking in certain areas, like many countries have banned smoking indoors. Potentially consider alcohol-free places. There was some interesting debates in Estonia where we've had a national sort of big kind of singing and dancing festival, which sounds bizarre, but it's a big thing. Everybody sort of goes every 4 years. And that has to be, it used to be very kind of beer heavily dominated and marketed. And one year, some medical students just got together and said, this is a bit silly. They wrote to the organizer to say maybe we could, you know, make the beer drinking more of a minority theme rather than a majority theme. And they went ahead with that. So that the beer selling and drinking is now at the sidelines rather than everywhere. And families can go and enjoy an alcohol-free day if they wish, without sort of being made felt like they were the outsiders. And that's just one of the many prongs that we've used in Estonia as an eye opener. With diet, there's a kind of alternative approach, which is actually encourage or sometimes regulate companies to lower their unhealthy product levels. Warnings usually work, should and could be used in all three approaches. And likewise, if companies aren't advertising their unhealthy commodities, they potentially should ban those adverts. And finally, behind my head is the step of one-to-one counselling, which is definitely indicated for tobacco. It's very, very effective and very cost-effective for the healthcare system. For alcohol, it's borderline. But for diet, we haven't really figured out any really useful one-to-one counselling service that would work for average people of normal weight who would really need to change their diet because they get lots of NCDs from their poor diets. But we haven't really figured out a service for them yet. But hopefully that could happen with the decades to come. And as we do move down the list, you'll see I've kind of alluded to blood pressure, because it's one of the topical risk factors, which could be altered also by diet. Or you could potentially screen for it, but the evidence base for that is a bit weak. For cancer, screening programs are very good and should be supported. For CVD, it's a bit weaker. We'll look at that in a minute. And I'll mention vaccinations as another route to actually eradicate cancer, because we're learning that many cancers are caused by viruses, which we have vaccines for. So this is my take-home slide of sort of top public health prevention approaches for the big risk factors and common diseases. Okay, so like I said, there are some diseases. Well, what we've talked about so far was what we do with the cause is known. And when the cause is known, I say, and many people say, do this. But often the cause is unknown, and we can still do something for those patients and those people before they get the disease and die of it. For example, screening programs. So I tend to think of them as like proper 4A national screening programs that are good and evidence-based and really work, and then slightly suspicious, opportunistic initiatives, sometimes by the private market, which are often advertised generally to the public directly to consume at their own expense. And occasionally they do kind of advance and develop into proper national screening programs, but sometimes they're just suspicious and should be regulated out and not be allowed because they actually cause more harm at worst case, and at best case they waste money. So let's just look at how you cleave those two apart. How do you know whether a screening program you've heard about is either a 4A, a good one, or a 4B, a bad one? And here's one that caught my eye. A big kind of a supplier of laboratory tests in Estonia called SynLab advertise on their website. For 60 euros, you can get this panel of all sorts of tests. You can do it every couple of years, and they haven't got any GPs. So if you get any uncertain results or abnormal results, then it just sort of, pushes you out of their building and says, good luck, and walk around with your results and do what you can with them. So it sort of leaves the burden of advising back to the public healthcare system outside of this private lab building. So I'm not a big advocate for such approaches, and not many people are. Along the same ballpark, there's a lot of interest and enthusiasm around the concept of, hey, why don't we give people some genetic data about themselves? So if I tell you that you've got a gene that makes you at slightly higher risk of diabetes, maybe that info will encourage you to change your diet. And lots of randomized control studies have looked at that question and said, no, it doesn't help. So it's just as useful and much cheaper to say, I don't know anything about your genes, but I do know that you probably should change your diet. And that will generate the same degree of behavior change. So it's nice to know where the evidence lies when you see some of these buzzwordy, contentious claims occasionally being put out even by politicians. Okay, so let's go back to proper national screening programs. So behind my face, I've listed the top ones that are the best, which have really good evidence base, such as all sorts of newborn screening programs. When a child is born, prick their heel, do a little blood test, and occasionally you find something rare, which you can treat very easily. That's a very good screening program. Cervical cancer rates also have been coming down slowly over time due to background changes in sexual behavior. And then when the program for screening was introduced in the late 80s, you see a beautiful change in the trend. And all these women, between these two lines that would have otherwise got cancer now have not, and their health has been improved because of the screening program. So that's just one illustration of it, and randomized trials sort of support that same claim. So a very good screening program. And recently, as we've introduced the vaccine, it might mean that the background incidence and prevalence of this cancer may become so low that screening may one day be scrapped, because the virus is an even better approach. But back in the 80s and 90s, this was a fantastic way in. And it still is. It should continue for people of my generation. Then as we come down the list, we've got bowel cancer screening programs that are really up and coming and meeting the mark in many ways. For a triple A, which is abdominal aortic aneurysm, that screening program seems to be useful in many cases, and for breast cancer as well, that's a fantastic screening program. So they should usually be advocated because the evidence base is great. Now, as we come down the list, for heart disease, it's a bit suspicious. No one's really quite cracked it yet of how you really screen for it. For prostate cancer, you can create a lot of harm. And for lung cancer, quite a rare disease, so it's probably not worth screening everybody. And general health checks to do a little bit of everything hasn't really shown its salt either, but it is a very attractive way to make money for the provider by sort of lying to your customer and saying that this is useful use of your money, but it usually is not. So when we look at a country like the UK that has a very rigorous system of deciding whether any proposed screening program is allowed to come in nationally and be funded on the NHS, they have lots of criteria. And this is a summary slide of how they make their decisions. But point one is that a randomized controlled trial has to show that half the people who randomly get given the screening program and half the people don't get the screening program. So that's what you need to do. And the outcome of that trial has to show that the benefits in green and the people that have been randomized to screening are greater than any harms they get. So you have to show net health gain. And if you break it down, this is how it sort of usually works in most screening programs, is that everybody that's in the screening arm will get invited to a pre-symptomatic test, which is quite simple and straightforward. It might create a bit of stress and anxiety for some people. And after that, most people that have had the test will walk away quite reassured, which is nice. Maybe with a bit of residual lingering anxiety in case they just got alarmed about something they read about, but nothing major. But some people will, after that test, be given a letter or a phone call saying, oh, we're still not sure about your results. We want you to come back for a second test because there's something that may or may not be going on with you. Now, that letter is very stressful. So even if you're later on reassured, the process of waiting for that second test is really stressful. And people often walk away still being quite distressed by that. And we should be mindful of how much harm we're creating and being able to quantify that and comparing it against any benefits we might create in a really rigorous way. So let's go back. So the pre-test, the early test tells you that you're not sure. The second test can itself, by the act of doing the test, which is more invasive, for example, a needle biopsy of a breast or prostate, can cause quite serious side effects. So occasionally when taking a prostate biopsy, you can make men impotent, you can lose their urine control, and often that intervention was not necessary. So it was just an example of the system harming you physically when it was not needed or required. And that again has to be quantified. Now, sometimes when people go through that second test, a biopsy, they get a diagnosis because they can see cancer and they get put on treatment and they feel anxious but perhaps relieved that they got the treatment early. And occasionally that early treatment was useful because they will then live a longer life. But sometimes those people that were diagnosed and treated didn't really get any benefit from the treatment because even though they had a cancer, they could have easily lived with that cancer for many decades without this cancer actually killing them. They could have died of heart disease before the cancer would have got them or been hit by a bus. So prostate cancer is a good example whereby most people that if you screen for it and you find lots of prostate cancer, most of those prostate cancers will never actually kill anybody, even though we label them as worrisome, harmful cancers to intervene upon and treat. So we're still not very good at kind of picking out cancers that will actually kill you as opposed to cancers that look like they're harmful, but they're not. So differentiating these last 2 points is also very, very difficult, which is why we can argue about this, forever. And the only way to really know for sure about whether these red bits are greater than the green bit is to do a randomized trial, which is why they're needed. And even if you do one and you show that the green bit is greater than all the 4 red bits combined, you secondly have to show that it's relatively cheap, that to save one person's year of life will cost around about less than 20,000 euros or pounds for that life year created. And occasionally you've got a few more criteria to think about. For example, even if you've got a great screening program for, let's say, lung cancer screening, which works out to be borderline cost effective, maybe it's costing like £15,000 per life year saved. If you've got other services available, like smoking cessation advisors and nurses and nicotine replacement patches, that's much, much, much cheaper. You should really maximize the cheaper approach first and saturate it so you can no longer supply it because the smokers don't want to come or the nurses are not around. Once you can no longer do anything better, you should move on to screening approaches that are seen as being the approach of last resort. And I'll mention briefly how occasionally treatment approaches do actually prevent. So with HIV, if you get everybody who's properly diagnosed on proper treatment, that helps them not pass it on to other people. And they should also be optimized before you start thinking about HIV mass screening programs. Again, for cost reasons. And if you are thinking about a brand new screening program, such as for heart disease or prostate cancer or anything else like that, then you can't just create the evidence base and expect it to be implemented overnight because you have to find hundreds of thousands of new staff that could deliver this in a big country and lots of new machines and equipment and reagents. You have to think about how you can launch that. When these programs were launched back in the 80s, that maneuvering of pulling it off, over a couple of years took a lot of planning and logistics. And that's an art in itself, as we've recently learned also with the COVID epidemic. Okay, so I'm just going to see how much time we've got left. Okay, I'm going to just whistle through this because I'm trying to wrap up now. Like I've mentioned, I'm interested in creating new heart disease screening programs We've got some algorithms out there that you can go to a GP and they ask lots of questions. They'll try and predict your risk of getting a heart attack. And I made a few algorithms myself, which were sort of done behind the scenes just by analyzing existing data that we can pull out of the GP record without having to ask anything from the patients. Almost like screening programs that you could run automatically on big data sets to pick out needles in haystacks. And they work just like simple linear equations, y equals x plus b. And I made a couple of basic algorithms where if you sort of crudely color code people into being low risk, leave them alone, medium risk, not sure what to do with them, red risk, they really need to be seen in clinic by a GP and have a chat about statins. Then what we've seen is that the people that actually need statins or are put on statins, the black dots, they overlap quite nicely with the red side. So I was thinking that the black spectrum might be sort of everywhere, but the fact that it's clumping in the right-hand side of the screen means that I can use my simple automated approach towards screening existing GP record data. And that's quite a powerful tool in to really think about revolutionizing screening programs where we can say, we don't need to invite all these people in to see a person face to face. That's just a waste of their time, our money. Let's just focus on these people. But what we need to do that is we need to analyze existing data, which brings its own challenges. And what we're hoping to do in Southwark, for example, in London, is to launch this new service, a bit like a regular randomized trial where half of the people get the new service and half of them carry on with the old service. But in our case, we want to bring them out step by step by step. So it's called a stepped wedge randomized control trial. And we're allocating a whole GP cluster to go live in one go. So it's called a cluster randomized control trial. That's what we've got in the pipeline. It may or may not get a go ahead, but we hope and think this could happen quite soon. And then at the end of that, we'll know very rigorously whether the new service is performing as we expect and how good it really is. We've got some other models of doing CVD screening that are really valid in countries like Estonia that have great electronic healthcare records and other social data sets. So we've got all these databases that could be linked together using, sounds very scary in the UK, but using a national ID card and a personal identification number, which makes record linkage really easy because you can't really make mistakes. It's very accurate. And perhaps with analyzing all this data, we could be really quite savvy about predicting who's going to have a heart attack. So when we have these old-fashioned systems like these health checks programs in the UK, where in order to prevent one CVD event hiding behind my head, we have to screen invite 5,000 people and have 2,000 people attend for a face-to-face check. Hopefully, if we create highly automated systems, we might be able to prevent 6 CVD events after only seeing maybe 600 people face-to-face. So this is a massive game changer for efficiency and highly targeted services. Right, so I'll wrap up here with my final slide. Of take-home points that don't forget that basic epidemiology sounds a bit boring, but it's really important because without it, you're just left with this sea of opinion and competing priorities based on who shouts the loudest. But if you know the fact about where the disease is and who's got it, you can really be quite focused in making sure the resources go to the right place. But we still have some big scientific puzzles, like why is CVD much higher in some places? Haven't cracked that one yet. It's useful to then think about what might cause disease. And we've got a lot of issues in this light blue space about what's causing neurological disease. No one knows, but there's loads of data out there that people should be jumping on to analyze, like from the UK Biobank, all sorts of stuff that could be brought in to get new insights and discoveries. Once we know what the causes are, we need to remove them, usually by doing tax, adverts, and access policy. And once that's done well, then we can move on to more individualized one-to-one approaches. And in diet, anything goes because basically we haven't got anything. We don't do anything for diet, neither in the population-based sledgehammer space nor in the individualized intervention space. So when I register with my GP in the UK or go to hospital with a broken knee, no one ever asks me about my diet ever. They might check my weight occasionally, but diet as an independent risk factor is never mentioned. So It's bizarre because it's a leading risk factor, but no one asks about it, let alone thinks about intervening upon it. But I think they should. And finally, if you are thinking about screening programs, do be rigorous. Think about proper science, randomized trials, and if they're not available, don't be so optimistic about the benefits they might create, because occasionally they can cause a lot of harm. And if you've got a new program you want to bring out, just please launch it in a randomly allocated way, which can be quite simple to do. Look forward to chatting to you in person. Thank you very much.